I'm pretty sure this is my first look at a watch from Baltic. I don't know why it took so long. Baltic watches are pretty popular in the fun and irrational world of affordable watch collecting. But here we are, with the newest watch from Baltic and maybe the brand's biggest release. Biggest both physically and figuratively. These are the two Baltic Tricompax watches, and they just became available for pre-order. Baltic is a fairly young brand, starting only in 2017 and located in France, and France is also where all its watches are assembled. And since 2017, Baltic has been making what I would consider exclusively vintage-inspired watches. You know, timepieces that are reminiscent of old watches, but in most cases don't have the price tag or the risk or the maintenance cost of actual vintage watches. Because, like a vintage person, vintage watches need a lot of expensive upkeep, and I'm not holding my breath for universal orological healthcare. So if you appreciate the look of watches from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, Baltic might make a few you'd like. I think these Tricompax watches will appeal to a lot of people, and not just watch nerds, and that's because this is a very classic design, almost archetypal, and maybe even too archetypal. These watches can be pre-ordered from December 1st to December 11th, with the first expected delivery being in April of 2023. This actually isn't the first Baltic Tricompax watch. In August, the brand announced a 300-piece limited collaboration with Peter Otto. Those are long gone and were slightly more expensive than these new regular production chronographs. But other than the dials, that limited edition was the same as these. These are the two Tricompax watches, the Panda and the Reverse Panda, which it turns out is not a Kama Sutra term. The Panda being the one with a light dial and the dark subdials, the Reverse Panda being the other one. Just like with the previous limited edition, the only difference between these is the dial. The case, the bracelet options, the hands, bezel, all of that is the same. The case is 39.5 millimeters across, 47 millimeters long, and 13.5 millimeters thick, including the big sapphire crystal. Just the metal of the case is only 10.7 millimeters thick, and the lug spacing is 20 millimeters. The watch weighs about 125 grams on the bracelet, or 76 grams on the leather strap. The water resistance is 50 meters, and I asked Baltic what 50 meters means to them, and they told me that it's resistant to splashing and maybe dunking in water, but you probably should not swim with this, which sounds like a dare to me. On the bracelet, the Tricompax costs $1,656 or $1,596 on the strap. Inside these watches is the Sellita SW510M movement. The M stands for manual. These are manually wound movements. That's one of the ways that these watches are kept relatively slim. The SW510 has up to 63 hours of power reserve, which is especially useful in manual movements. This movement debuted only in 2017, and it's become popular specifically with smaller brands like Baltic, and I think that's great. Finally, watchmakers that don't have a connection with ETA or Swatch can get their hands on affordable Swiss chronograph movements. Mechanical Swiss chronograph movements. My wrist is 18 centimeters around, that's just over 7 inches, but I expect it to grow considerably this holiday season. But for now, 39.5 millimeters across and 47 millimeters long is just perfect. And despite the movement and the 13.5 millimeter thickness, the watch feels very stable. It's not top heavy, even on the light and thin leather strap. The bracelet is also pretty light and thin. This style of bracelet is called a flat link bracelet, and it was very popular with watches in the 60s and 70s, and so I think it looks just right with this watch. It tapers from 20 millimeters at the lugs to 16.5 millimeters right before the clasp. And for better or worse, it kind of feels like a vintage bracelet. It's light, it's thin, it's got a little wiggle, it's got a little rattle, all of which I like. But I know for some people, the heavier and stiffer the bracelet, the more value people think they're getting from it. I say stop worrying about how much money a watchmaker put into manufacturing something and start thinking about whether you like how it looks and feels, and for me, I like both. The clasp has 2 micro adjustment spots. I'd prefer more even at the expense of a larger clasp. The links use screws, which I like, and the watch even comes with a Baltic screwdriver, which is a really nice touch, but how dare Baltic imply that I don't have a messy drawer full of miscellaneous screwdrivers like a proper gentleman would. The end links have quick release spring bars, and with the 20mm lugs, I think either of these dials would look great with just so many strap options. And the Baltic leather strap also has quick release spring bars and feels very nice, very supple. If you're not sure about getting this on the bracelet or the strap, you can do both. I think it's about €50 more to add the strap to the bracelet option. Because I have a pathological amount of straps collecting dust, I might go for the bracelet and just use my own straps, but for people who have real lives, the Baltic strap could be a good addition. And the lugs are drilled through, so even if you're using traditional spring bars, they'll be really easy to remove. The design of these chronographs is really classic. If you ask how much more classic could they be, the answer is none. None more classic. I think a lot of people will look at these and think immediately of a vintage Daytona. And those people aren't wrong, bless their hearts, but what I see is closer to some of the old Universal Genève Tricompax watches. But the truth is there were a lot of 3-register chronographs with aluminum tachometer bezels, which brings me back to what I said earlier. Maybe this is too archetypal, too unoriginal in its design. I do think it's original as a complete package, which happened to be my nickname in college. There aren't many watches at this price with this look and this type of movement, but visually, maybe it's too obvious. Now, there are a couple of things which I think help mitigate that. The applied 12 at 12 o'clock, it's uncommon without being ostentatious or too bold. And second is the contrasting chapter ring along the dial's periphery. This was also kind of uncommon in Panda watches, and I really like how it frames the rest of the dial. I think if there was more text on the dial, that the whole thing would be just too busy, but thankfully Baltic did things right and didn't do something like Baltic, France, chronograph, Tricompax, unofficially uncertified. The Lume is BGW9 Superluminova, and the application of it isn't anything special. There are lume dots around the dial, but the main hands are really the only thing you'll be able to see in the dark. Not great, not terrible, not surprising. But I was surprised by the design of the boxes these watches come in. They're not luxurious, but they look luxurious, much like myself. They're big, pretty, they have drawers and stuff. I've seen boxes from luxury Swiss brands that don't look anywhere near this good. Which brings me back to the audience for these watches. Speaking as someone who literally has too many watches than he knows what to do with, I really don't want a large presentation box. But for the broader market who rarely spends big on a watch, having a box with a memorable presentation, I think that's just right. Between the largely unobjectionable design of this watch, the price, and the presentation of it, I think this Tricompax could have a big appeal to a big market. And I know it's also striking the right notes with nerds too. I took these to a local watch meetup and people were very into these watches, and I get it. Now, am I gonna buy one? No, I'm not. I've learned the hard way that chronographs just don't stick for me. I just don't use their functions, and also, I prefer more water resistance than these offer. But the quality is good for the price, the design is attractive, the details are thoughtful, and even though the vintage aesthetic isn't for me, I like what Baltic has been doing. You see, even if you personally don't want to own a certain watch, you can still appreciate it. I'm just throwing that out there for whoever. As far as I know, you won't be able to see these in stores, so videos like this will be your best look at these watches. So my sincere apologies. You might have to suffer my humor several times over just to get some useful information. But at least now you have more sympathy for my wife.